When Nazi troops surrendered in May 1945, not only did one of the most devastating wars in history end, but a new race for control of the abandoned military power began. Amidst destroyed cities, empty fields, and closed factories, thousands of tons of German weapons were scattered across Europe: rifles, tanks, airplanes, rockets. The Reich's war machine did not disappear with its defeat. By contrary, he converted in object of desire of the victorious powers. Who would take this technology? What secrets did these inventions hide? And how many of these weapons would be used again in future conflicts? Far from being completely destroyed, many were recovered, studied, and adapted. In this episode, we'll travel back to the moment when the war ended, but the weapons survived. This is what really happened to Nazi weapons after the fall of the Third Reich. Hitler's wonder weapons that were supposed to change the world but failed. Hitler's fantasies were sometimes gigantic. This phrase he attributes to Heinz Guderian, a prominent German army officer who survived World War II. With these words, the military man summed up his opinion of the Führer's ambitious plans to create armament further advanced of the world. From 1942, the dictator ordered scientists from the Third Reich design arms powerful enough to annihilate the Allies on the battlefield. The result of this research was curious and extravagant prototypes, which were not always manufactured, but whose technical plans have survived to this day. On the Eastern Front, the Germans they found with two obstacles formidable: the fortresses of Brest-Litovsk and Sevastopol. In order to besiege these citadels and force their occupants to surrender, the Wehrmacht mobilized one of its most unusual weapons, Karl Gerhardt. He was trying of the mortar of siege, the world's largest self-propelled vehicle. It weighed 124 tons, was 11 meters long and almost 5 meters high. Meters. For be operated required of a crew of 21 people, composed of a commander, 2 drivers, and 18 gunners. This model was equipped with a powerful 600mm long-barreled mortar which reached a distance of 6.8 kilometers. Its use in warfare was limited due to that, so only they manufactured 7 copies. For the troops besieged by her fire of the Karl Gerhardt, it had to be an experience terrifying approach the projectiles, since the munitions could weigh up to 2 tons each and produced craters 15 meters in diameter and 5 meters deep. After spreading terror among 1942 and 1944, several specimens of this brutal mortar, also acquaintance like the Thor, they were captured by the Red Army. Several disappeared, and some can be seen in Russian weapons museums. Towards the end of the war, the Germans introduced an aircraft that, according to some historians, could have regained air superiority for the Luftwaffe. It was the Messerschmitt Me 262, one of the first combat aircraft jet fighter in the world. Although it was designed to perform as a fighter, it was also used in attack missions, to land and reconnaissance. It was equipped with 4 30mm Mk108 cannons on the nose, capable of firing 660 rounds per minute, and 2 underwing launchers that fired R-4M air-to-air rockets. If just one of these missiles hit, the enemy bomber was left completely destroyed, and precipitated to floor in flames. The Allies. No, they counted with a weapon similar, although the Me 262 had a fatal weakness. It was an aircraft incapable of making a tight turn, and it suffered from delays when landing or taking off. Therefore, it was common for the Allies to try to shoot it down during these phases, when we're in the middle of the airbase. Between 1944 and 1945, 300 examples of this aircraft entered combat, inflicting more than 500 enemy casualties. Despite its potential, its late introduction into the war rendered its impact negligible. The Allies managed to capture a few examples of this futuristic aircraft for its time, to the which considered the better part of engineering German, and used it to develop their own jet fighters, such as the Soviet MiG-15. One of the most curious and destructive weapons of the Nazis was the one the Allies nicknamed the Beetle tank. It was the Goliath, a small remote-controlled demolition vehicle that measured 1.5 meters in length, 0.85 meters in width, and 0.56 meters in height. Tall, although its weight was 370 kilograms. Its purpose was to carry explosive charges weighing between 60 and 100 kilos, penetrate enemy ranks and explode, damaging tanks, men, or buildings. However, the Goliath was considered a failure because it was very expensive to produce, but for the Allies, very simple to destroy. It moved at a very low speed, making it an easy target, and its armor was so thin that any anti-tank weapon could render it useless with a single shot. However, nearly a dozen of these unusual vehicles have been preserved and can be visited in various European countries. The Panzer VIII Maus was a monstrous tank of the further big manufactured in the Third Reich and the heaviest of the history. Was designed for terrorize to his enemies with his dimensions. He weighed 180 tons and averaged 3.5 meters high, 10 long and 3.5 wide. As for its armament, it was equipped with a 128mm primary cannon and a 75mm secondary cannon. It also had MG-34 machine guns in support. It could move to 15 kilometers per hour, with an autonomy of 160 kilometers until run out of fuel. Although there were plans to mass-produce the Maus as early as 1942, the Allies they carried out several campaigns of bombings about the factories where the models were developed. In this way, the production of the tank, it was postponed in a way indefinite until that, to the moment of finish the war, only 2 prototypes had been made. The first prototype was destroyed, while the second was captured by the Red Army, which restored and completed its construction, and it survives to this day. However, it was never used, as its speed and difficulty in maneuvering immediately rendered it obsolete in the face of modern warfare. Today, modern armed forces rely on smart bombs that, upon landing, can move until they reach their target. The precursor to these explosives is the Fritz X, an anti-ship guided bomb used by the Luftwaffe. It weighed 1,300 kilograms, was 3 meters long and 85 centimeters in diameter. To make it more aerodynamic, the Nazis, it was equipped with 4 small fins and a box-shaped tail. Once dropped from an airplane, it was guided to its target via radio waves. Meanwhile, a crew member of the aircraft I had to take charge of coordinate the fall, and to do so, it had to maintain visual contact with the explosive to ensure it hit the target. However, this was its main weakness, since the plane had to remain over the bomb to carry out the guidance. During those moments, it was susceptible to all kinds of attacks by part of the fighter's enemies. The Fritz X caused sinking of several ships' allies, and by that, the British. They worked hard to recover as many of these bombs as possible, which are considered the first step in the development of smart missiles. Around 1943, the Nazis designed an air-to-ground missile that could be launched from the range of enemy fighter machine guns and also be guided to the target. The result was the Ruhrstahl X-4, a powerful bomb that weighed 60 kilograms and measured 2 meters of long, 0.5 of broad and 0.2 of diameter. Ruhrstahl could be launched from an altitude of 5 kilometers and was capable of reaching a speed of 1,100 kilometers per hour. The missile's payload consisted of a 20-kilogram fragmentation device, and the blast radius was lethal within 8 meters. The bomber's pilot could operate it with a remote control, affecting its roll and pitch, although the guidance system had not yet been perfected. Production began late in 1945, but the Allies quickly saw the threat that meant, and they bombed the facility's manufacturing. Thus, the Ruhrstahl never fully realized its potential, as it was never delivered to the Luftwaffe for mass use. However, some of the prototypes can now be seen in museums in Germany. There are many rumors about the possible technological developments that Hitler's scientists carried out in his time as dishes flyers, supersonic aircraft, or giant armored trucks. But the extravagant Kugelpanzer war tank was an extremely crazy idea that was carried out. This unique combat vehicle is known as the ball tank and is one of the most mysterious Nazi artifacts that survived the war in Europe. Little is known for certain about the Kugelpanzer, and most of the known information arose from hypotheses that post-dated its creation. The only prototype of this strange tank was found by the Soviets, in a state of abandonment and with he inside completely naked. He did evident that the Nazis had destroyed and removed all the items of navigation, such as weapons, to prevent the technology from being discovered. Due to his size, it becomes clear that it is of a vehicle armored for an only operator, already that its height is that of a standing person. Nevertheless, a copy of the Kugelpanzer, although it showed German manufacture, it was found in Manchuria, where it was apparently used as a reconnaissance tank by the Japanese army. Perhaps one day the details of this weapon's existence will be revealed, and it remains on display at the Kubinka Tank Museum. Straight out of a horror or science fiction story, we find the Zielgerät 1229, also known by its code name, Vampire, or the Vampire. It was an active night vision device that captured infrared frequencies and could be installed on sniper rifles. This system allowed for clearer targeting during night shifts and was primarily used as an accessory for the Sturmgewehr 44 assault rifle. The ZG-1229 was battle-tested in 1944 and near the end of the war entered massively in service with a deployment of 310 systems for snipers of the Wehrmacht. Soldiers armed with the Vampire were known as the Night Hunters, either Nightjäger. In his system was compounded by a scope, an infrared sight, a flashlight, and a battery which weighed 30 pounds alone. The soldier also had to carry a backpack to which the ZG-1229 was connected, which added another battery and a gas mask with a built-in infrared sight. His entry into service about the end of the war, it turned out in that his use did not extend beyond in some fronts of battle, by it which he system it died quickly. Some claim that despite its cost and difficulty in manufacturing, it was highly successful in night campaigns, and the Wehrmacht hoped to also implement it in the MG-34 and MG-42 machine guns. Although it was discontinued with the fall of Germany, the Vampire anticipated today's personal infrared systems by more than a decade. However, all these wonderful weapons pale in comparison to Adolf Hitler's most ambitious and also most futile project, Gustav the Heavy. Gustav the Heavy, the story of the weapon that promised to give Hitler victory but never made it to the end of the war. In 1942, Adolf Hitler put on the battlefield the largest weapon ever used in combat. We are talking about a cannon of titanic proportions, 4 stories high and more than 30 meters long, which required thousands of men to operate and fired cartridges capable of penetrating layers of up to 7 meters of concrete. However, this pharaonic weapon responded to the megalomaniacal desires of the Führer, who loved everything that was large and imposing, although it was not so useful as the Wehrmacht I expected. After a year after being used with difficulty in several campaigns, the Dora, or Heavy Gustav cannon, had to be withdrawn from service since its brutal size presented more problems than advantages when besieging cities defended by the Allies. The design of Gustav the Heavy, or Schwerer Gustav in German, dates back to the late 1930s at the beginning of World War II. Hitler wanted a powerful weapon that would be able to penetrate defenses. Allies in France, in the line Maginot that protected to the country Gallic forehead to the advance of the Germans. The French forts were large, multi-layered concrete structures which represented the last defensive bastion that the Germans had to cross. Führer's forces to occupy the country. For this reason, Hitler ordered his engineers to develop a weapon capable of penetrating walls several meters thick of concrete, or at least 1 meter thick steel plates. The Krupp family was responsible for the design and manufacture of the Heavy Gustav, who completed the commission 2 years later, at the end of 1941. Fortunately for the Nazis, the Blitzkrieg strategy, which involved motorized tank regiments, was sufficient to capture France. When the Gustav was finally presented, Hitler was fascinated. The metal mole measured 47.3 meters long, 7.1 meters wide, and 11 meters high. Its imposing cannon, which gave it an effective range of 40 kilometers, rose to the sky with more than 30 meters long and culminated in an 80-centimeter opening, which determined its caliber. As for its ammunition, the Gustav used gigantic rounds of between 4,800 kilograms and 7,100 kilograms, with explosive charges varying between 250 kilograms and 700 kilograms, being able to penetrate layers of until 7 meters of concrete or 1 meter of steel, respectively. Each projectile was almost 4 meters long, and its diameter varied between 80 centimeters and 1 meter. This made that any bunker out completely vulnerable to the fateful bang of the Gustav, who was unloading the tremendous cartridges of nickel and aluminum as he fist of an angry god. For this titanic cannon to destroy the buildings the most heavily fortified in Europe, only 7 shots were required. Due to the high cost and manufacturing time, only 2 Gustavs were produced, although only the one so named was used, while the second unit, called the Dora, was probably never fired. After his hard efforts, Gustav the Heavy finally saw battle during Operation Barbarossa, in which Adolf Hitler invaded the Union Soviet. Was during the siege of Sevastopol, the titanic cannon was requisitioned by the Wehrmacht. The The city is located on the Crimean Peninsula, was strongly defended by the Soviet Black Sea Fleet, one of the largest subunits inside of the Red Army Navy. By other part, the line that protected Sevastopol was plagued of impenetrable granite forts, gave the Soviets an enormous strategic advantage over the Germans, who, although outnumbered, could only crash into the enormous concrete and metal buildings. Each raid meant a loss of key elements, which increased the cost of the campaign day by day. It is still unknown why Hitler decided to embark on such a costly project without having previously tested it in battle, although some point out that the Gustavs were a product of his megalomania and ambition. Which you believe that were the true reasons of the Führer to promote the production of several mega cannons? Leave us your opinion in the comments box. That's when the biggest weapon in history came into play. For months, a special team of engineers directed thousands of workers that they laid railway tracks towards Sevastopol to allow the Gustav to reach its destination. We must bear in mind, for grasp this, that the titanic mass weighed 1,350 tons, the equivalent of 60 Panzer IV tanks, not counting their ammunition, which, as mentioned, ranged from 4.8 to 7 tons per shell. If we take into account that the Gustav could fire up to 14 rounds per day and would be used for several months in the Soviet Union, this added up to several thousand tons more in supply. In fact, the brutal weight of the cannon and its particular design forced the developers to create special tracks on which it was not only transported, but also they carried out maneuvers to position it before being fired. However, the setting in March of the Gustav implied the job of thousands of people for their movement, while that hundreds of soldiers they worked about the pharaonic structure to fire it. The measurements and aiming had to be precise, as you can imagine, since each spent bullet cost a fortune and was extremely difficult to replace, since the supplies were taking weeks in be transported from one point to another. At the same time, their firepower was limited, and they took a long time, several hours, between the preparation of a shot and it that allowed that the cannon would open fire at most 14 times a day. With a 100% accuracy in each round, the Gustav could destroy 2 fortifications per day. However, as mentioned above, despite its destructive power, the Gustav had many operational problems on the battlefield. To begin with, the difficulties in transporting it did not go unnoticed by the German High Command, who, perhaps too late, realized that with the time and money invested in transporting the Gustav, they could mobilize entire battalions of heavy artillery or medium tanks. Even more complex was determining their firing position, for which he needed that the engineers laid the special rails at a distance of at least 50 kilometers from the target. Once the railway structure was built, the colossus of metal he would maneuver, carefully following the instructions of the aiming corps, and then position his cannon at an angle. Finally, the rest of the crews operated the various mechanisms that led to the firing of a projectile. It is also important to say that they had to hold on to something. Most of the soldiers working on the Gustav did so on the large structure, as he would try of a 4-story building, which generated a huge recoil so that if they were not properly secured, they could fall from a height of 10 meters. The worst of the setback was that I had to relocate to the Gustav for following shot. In addition of that, according to land, no only could move cannon, but that also the rails. But the difficulty that led to the mega cannon being removed had to do with its defensive capabilities. Due to it colossal of his size, and that had to be installed in field open, Gustav represented an aim extremely easy for Allied bombers, since a 40-meter-long cannon, mounted to a system of rails and surrounded by thousands of soldiers, could be spotted from a distance without difficulty. Although during the campaign in Crimea shot nails 250 rounds, after which it was dismantled and taken to Germany, never to see action again, although it left a great mark on history as the largest cannon ever built. Seas of blood, Germany's staggering human losses in World War II. Germany's defeat in World War II was brutal, as evidenced by its human and material losses. Nearly half of its soldiers, including those in training, members of the SS, conscripts and volunteers, died, and of those who survived, only 20% completed the conflict unscathed. The figures are truly grim. The armed forces of Nazi Germany during World War II, including the Heer, Waffen-SS, Kriegsmarine and Luftwaffe, generally suffered a mortality rate of more than 30% and a total casualty rate of more than 80%. The total average number of men serving in the armed forces of all branches of Nazi Germany, including non-German servicemen, was around 15 million. By the end of World War II, more than 5.5 million of those men lost their lives, and another 7 million were wounded or missing. The remainder became prisoners of war or were discharged, officially or unofficially, depending on where the serviceman was located, which side of the Allied or Soviet advance captured him, and whether he managed to elude capture and blend into the German population after hostilities ceased. This means that the average German serviceman had only a 20% to 30% chance of not being wounded. Most of the more than 5.5 million military personnel who died did so in the East, fighting against the Soviet Union. More than 4.4 million German soldiers, airmen and servicemen of all branches died on the Eastern Front, facing Stalin's Red Tide. More than 650,000 died on the Western Front, approximately 50,000 in combat with the forces French and of the Lowlands, more than 400,000 in combat with US forces, and more than 100,000 in combat with Commonwealth and British forces. At the end of World War II, 1 in 2 Luftwaffe pilots who served in the German Air Force died, with a rate of mortality superior at 51%. More than 24% of all pilots of the Luftwaffe resulted wounded, and further 10% were captured. The total of lows of all Guy and Corps in he body of Luftwaffe pilots exceeded 90%. Some have tried to provide evidence suggesting that most Luftwaffe casualties were caused by accidents due to substandard pilots, but there is evidence to suggest a much sadder reality, that Western Allied pilots were shooting down inexperienced Luftwaffe pilots faster than they could crash their own planes. By 1944, the monthly attrition of Luftwaffe fighters had reached 137% casualties, since they were introduced replacements of low quality for curb the terrible casualty rates. The Luftwaffe became, in effect, a human meat grinder. It is also mentioned that the Germans lacked of fuel for their aircraft and accumulated such a horrendous loss rate, but they ignored the fact that they were short of fuel because they were allocating 3/4 of their total production to the fighter defense industry to counter strategic bombing by the USAAF and RAF. German fighters managed to maintain relatively stable combat formations while armored units and logistics suffered fuel shortages. There are always shortages. The sky of disillusionment. Where did the thousands of aircrafts of the Luftwaffe? In terms of material, the Germans manufactured more than 95,000 aircraft of all types since the end of the years 30 until 1945. To the end of the war, the Luftwaffe had suffered more than 90,000 airframe losses from all causes and actions on both fronts combined. More than 35,000 aircraft were lost in direct shootdowns. In He West, of the which further of 25,000 were to hands of the USAAF, more than 10,000 were captured by the RAF, and more than 14,000 were captured in the East by the Red Army. The remainder were destroyed on the ground, captured or lost in accidents and in transit. Material losses and of staff of the Luftwaffe in the West were 6 times greater than those suffered in the East. Germany manufactured nearly 95,000 aircraft of all types between 1938 and 1939, of which more than 90,000 were lost both operationally and non-operationally. Service. More than 30,000 aircraft were lost in combat with the USAAF, further of 10,000 with the Commonwealth and the RAF, and over 14,000 in the East against the Soviets. The remainder were destroyed in accidents, in transit either inland. The number of airplanes of the number of Luftwaffe aircraft surviving at the end of hostilities did not exceed thousands. Germany suffered a loss rate of over 90%, with pilot deaths exceeding 50%, or 1 in 2. Only about 2 Ju-88s survived the war, despite being one of the most produced designs in Germany, with recorded quotas of over 12,000 units. Both Ju-88s were transferred to Scotland by deserters. They exist some. There are records indicating the possible capture of a Ju-188 or Ju-388 by American forces in West Germany, but this was never officially verified. Ju-88 losses were so catastrophic during the Battle of Britain against the British and against the USAAF and RAF during initial operations in northern France that the aircraft was almost extinct. Therefore, apart from the test flights and their fate as part of museum, key use of the Ju-88's post-war airframe is non-existent. Similarly, only a few hundred remained FW-190 survivors of all types after the end of the war. The losses of the FW-190 were so brutal that again this aircraft was on the verge of extinction, although no as completely as the Ju-88. Turkey received 72 FW-190 examples in 1942 and 1943, which formed the main core of the Turkish Focke-Wulf survivors at the end of the war. Turkey used its small contingent of 190 until 1949 before dismantling and scrapping them. Over 70 FW-190s of various types saw service in Hungary between 1944 and 1945. And it is unknown how many of these aircraft survived the war, although probably no more than a handful after they were used against the Soviets and summarily against the Germans in 1944, unknown. Yeah, the Germans captured some of their own planes and took them back to Germany. The a few hundred German FW-190s that were not destroyed either on the ground or in the air at the end of the war ended up in Turkey, either to France. It fits stand out that at the end of the war, enough parts were captured from German factories to assemble more than 100 aircraft, but this does not at all demonstrate the capacity Luftwaffe survival kit that was terrible in 1944 and 1945. With our parts, France initially planned to assemble over 125 FW-190s, but it is unknown how many of these found kits were completed. France used its small number of FW-19s for the sole purpose of having some aircraft of combat, after his own inventory was left almost extinct after the invasion German. Until 1965, the French built more than 65 of their own variants of the FW-190, using them alongside examples obtained from the defunct Luftwaffe. Both Poland and Yugoslavia captured each one a only FW-190 that survived to the end of the war, and Romania had over 20 captured FW-190s afterward of its separation from the Axis in 1944. As a curious fact, there is only one recorded case of an FW-190 shooting down another FW-190 in a situation of combat. The pilot of the Luftwaffe shot down a Romanian FW-190 somewhere northwest of Bucharest in 1944. Some FW-190s were captured by the Soviets during the war, but again there are no records to indicate how many survivors there were at the end of the war from hostilities in the east. The British also captured some FW-190s during the war and tested them in flight. But unknown how many they finished the war in Commonwealth hands in 1945. The Americans test flew at least one FW-190 at some point during the war, but again there are no records indicating the exact number they captured. Interestingly, surviving examples of the Me-109 are harder to come by, despite over 30,000 being built compared to the more of 29,000 FW-190s. It is worth noting that many of the specimens survivors know are in reality German-made Me-109s, but copies of aircraft manufactured by the Czechoslovakian company Avia or Spanish copies produced during the Franco regime, of which there are more than several hundred. For example, the Me-109s that Israelis they used to it long of 1948 and 1949 against the Arabs were not Luftwaffe, but copy variants manufactured by Avia or Spain. It is known that the Soviets captured and they tried to the less 5 Me-109 throughout the war, although all were scrapped or destroyed by 1945. There are no records indicating how many Me-109s were captured in total by the Soviets in the East during and after of 1945. Of manner similar, the British and the Commonwealth captured more than 10 Me-109s and tested them between 1941 and 1944. There are no records to show how many 109s were captured intact in the lowlands and North Germany in the West by the British after 1945. The Americans took more than 4 examples before the conclusion of hostilities, but time further, no exist records that indicate how many 109s or unassembled kits were captured in 1945 at the end of the war. Glories of the past, the degrading future of the impressive German tanks. The German armored corps, similar to the Luftwaffe, was annihilated. During the war, the Germans produced more than 49,000 armored fighting vehicles of all types, more than 12,000 Panzer IVs and 10,000 Stug 3s. They manufactured almost half of this figure. During the war, more than 1,000 of these vehicles would be lost, mainly to the Commonwealth in North Africa, and others 5,000 in He Forehead Western, mostly against the Americans. More than 40,000 of all armored vehicles of Germany, they lost in this for various reasons. Once again, the people are attributed our losses to the German destruction of over 70% of their own arsenal. But this information is blatantly false and is not supported by the catastrophic death rates of German military personnel in combat operations, even taking into account air raids and artillery. The main causes of tank deaths Germans in West were the Canyons' anti-tank allies and their tanks improved. In Forehead Eastern, mud, snow, Soviet tanks and artillery were the main causes of casualties. One of the reasons why almost no German tank survives today in museums, unlike tanks from other countries, they were practically destroyed or abandoned. Only 2 designs in service in Germany suffered higher mortality rates when destroyed by their own crews compared to enemy action: the Jagdtiger and Elephant, due to his weight and their unreliability in combat. Initial Tiger and Panther losses in Normandy were roughly 50-50 between causes direct and own actions, such as mistakes of the crew, but this changed after the Day D, with a sudden increase in combat casualties and a decrease of the crew destructions. Panther tanks, out of more than 6,000 manufactured, survived the war. A few were scrapped and the rest were handed over to the French. After a brief period of evaluation and training, the French generally considered their Panthers to be cumbersome and unsuitable for frontline service. All French Panthers were decommissioned by 1965. The Soviets captured a handful of Panthers in the east and used some of them briefly in combat before the tanks will remain without ammunition were destroyed or damaged. The use of the Panther in the post-war period was non-existent in Soviet hands, as they had their own tanks more suited to their needs. All Soviet Panthers were scrapped or donated to museums. Tigers of both variants, contrary to the myth of their superiority on the battlefield of World War II, saw absolutely no post-war service or significant use in the 2000s hands of other countries, as they were considered waste material and hand of construction site, and suffered a wear almost total in cases of combat to the end of the war. The rates of losses of the Tiger I and II exceeded 90%, 100, and only some few Tiger Yo survive as parts museum in all world. Only exist 7 Tiger Yo and only 1 operational, Tiger 131. Only 8 Tiger IIs survive in museums and private collections. Ultimately, despite the great legend that was generated around this tank, the truth is that no one Tiger of none of the 2 variants are adopted for his use in the post-war period. The Panzer IV's post-war use was more extensive than most of the other entries on this list, as they saw brief combat use in the Middle East as late as the 1970s. This was due solely to their greater numbers and not to any features that made them attractive, for factions who could otherwise afford better post-war American, British or Soviet designs. Only a handful of the more than 12,000 Panzer IVs produced survived by 1945. Several were acquired by Syria, where they fought against the Israelis in 1948. The Panzer IV had already been outclassed in World War II by 1941. Armor and armament modifications only slightly improved its already low survival rate. This aging process was not unfounded, especially after the end of the war. The unit's Syrians that they used, Panzer IV, were shattered by the Centurions and the Super Sherman Israelis, equipped with 90mm cannons. Some Stu-G 3s were briefly used in the Middle East after the Second World War, since, together with the Panzer IV, they were the most produced armored vehicles by Germany during the war, with further of 12,000 IV and 10,000 Stu-G. The small amount of Stu-G exported could continue rhythm of the evolution of armored wars in the world, and often ended with destinations ignominious, such as their use in static fortifications. But beyond these brief memories of the past, German armored vehicles were a dead end and didn't enjoy the same extended use as some of their aircraft, such as the foreign-made copies of the Me-109. Naval battle: the different fates of the Reich's U-boats. In the case of the sailors of the Third Reich, the mortality surpassed 60% and 75% for U-boat sailors and operators of Germany's U-boat fleet. German U-boat sailors suffered the highest mortality rate, high of all the branches of service in the forces armed Germans during the Second War World, followed of nearby the Luftwaffe. Besides, Of the 1,100 submarines built, more than 630 were sunk, mainly due to direct combat causes such as Allied aircraft reconnaissance and anti-submarine warfare waged primarily by destroyers. This would imply a material loss rate for the German submarine fleet of over 57%. Most of the surrendered U-boats were sunk during Operation Deadlight, the code name given to the systematic sinking of U-boats surrendered to the Allies after the defeat of the Reich. Of the 156 U-boats that he surrendered at the end of the fight, 116 were thrown out to peak during the Operation Deadlight, which was devised by the Royal Navy and planned to tow the submarines to 3 areas around 150 kilometers northwest of Ireland and once sink them there. The areas were given the code names XX, WWII, and ZZ. The intention was to use Area 2020 as the main area to launch the ships. The remaining 36 were to be towed to ZZ for use as targets in air attack maneuvers. WWII was the reserved position for, in the event of good weather conditions and sufficient submarines available, being able to sink them as naval targets by naval artillery attacks. If they could not be used as targets, the ships were to be sunk using explosives, charges, combinations of these, or artillery fire if these failed. When Operation Deadlight was put into practice, he found that many of the submarines were in a very poor state of preservation due to the length of time they had been moored in port without maintenance, while they expected his destination. Combined with bad weather, this meant that 56 vessels sank before reaching designated scuttling areas, and that they got arrive were sunken generally by artillery fire rather than explosive charges. The first sinking took place on 17 November 1945 and the last on 12 February 1946. A handful of submarines were in East Asia and the Pacific when the Germans surrendered, and some were requisitioned by the Japanese for short periods of service before be destroyed, either delivered. An example of this anomaly is the U-181A, which briefly served under Japanese colors, as I-501 before being surrendered in 1945 and sunk in 1946 in the Strait of Malacca by British frigates. The submarine survivors, either found after the Operation Deadlight, were handed over to the Allied navies after the cessation of hostilities and suffered various fates. Some were used as targets or obstacles for sailors training at sea, either maneuverability, either as target for target practice, and torpedo guidance. Others were studied by older navies, but with the Cold War looming, there was virtually no notable technology to recover from. The U-boot by it that were converted in scrap. A handful of they also became in parts of museum, some of which still survive today, such as the U-995 in Lebo, Germany. Relics of times past, the arms Nazis that they used after the war. Sturmgewehr 44 assault rifle was a design German revolutionary. It arose of the wartime need for a more compact, semi-automatic infantry rifle with a high-capacity magazine at the cost of reduced range. This weapon later significantly influenced the development of the Russian AK-47 assault rifle. Few survived the war, as limited numbers were manufactured, and the 7.92 by 33 mm caliber made them impractical for widespread post-war military service. However, the East German paramilitary police used them for several years. The STG-44 was also used by the East German paramilitary police until 1962. However, this use of Axis weapons was the exception rather than the rule, as ammunition production was halted and many weapons had to be modified to use other types of Soviet-made bullets. However, there are also weapons that, due to their simplicity and basic use, never go out of style. This is the case of the Mauser Carabiner 98K, better known as Kar 98K, a bolt-action rifle that uses the 7.92 by 57 mm cartridge and was adopted as the standard infantry rifle in 1935 by the Wehrmacht. It was the most common rifle among German troops during World War II and was carried primarily by the infantry, the attendees and chargers of the armored units, and as a reserve weapon in fortifications or machine gun nests. During World War II, the Soviet Union captured millions of Mauser Kar 98K rifles and reconditioned them in various arms factories in the late 1940s and early 1950s. These rifles were originally stockpiled in case of future conflicts with the Western Bloc. However, most of these rifles were eventually supplied to communist or revolutionary countries and movements, to the less Marxists around the world, from Central Europe to Southeast Asia during the early period of the Cold War. During the Vietnam War, American soldiers found themselves in the hands of Viet guerrillas Cong and the People's Army of Vietnam a considerable quantity of Mauser Car 98K rifles captured by the Russians. Other countries, such as Israel, Belgium, Yugoslavia, either Czechoslovakia, also. They used the Mauser 98K until the 1970s, in some cases obtained from the Wehrmacht, and in others natively manufactured following the German model. Today in day, the Karabiner 98K can be seen at some military parades in Germany as a ceremonial weapon and is highly sought after by collectors or professional hunters, as it is an extremely reliable and accurate weapon. Another weapon that has survived to this day, albeit to a much lesser extent, is the Maschinenpistole 40, better known as the MP 40, the most widespread submachine gun among the troops of the Third Reich. Designed by Heinrich Vollmer with the end of endow to the soldiers of a weapon of assault, mostly to mechanized infantry and paratrooper units, was manufactured until the end of the conflict. This submachine gun excelled in close-range combat, but, like the rest of the automatic weapons of the time, it was less cash to field open due to its limited reach. This was one of the reasons that motivated the design of the STG-44, the predecessor of modern assault rifles. By the end of the war, more than 1 million MP-40s had been built, thousands of which were captured, by the Red Army on the Eastern Front and during the invasion of Germany. The MP-4's excellent workmanship allowed it to remain in service with Norwegian Army tank crews until the 1980s. It was also involved in the Indochina conflict in the 1990s, 50 and in Algeria. They are still used today as collector's items in professional and amateur shooting competitions and as training weapons in some armed forces. However, there was one machine gun that was truly capable of transcending to World War II, and which laid the foundations for heavy repeating armament in the future, so it deserves its own chapter, the MG-42. The fate of the brutal Nazi machine gun that changed the war forever. The Third Reich was a machinery-productive awesome that believed and produced en masse truly enviable weapons. Between that endless inventory there is a piece as iconic as it is brutal, the MG-42. With a nickname as forceful as Hitler's chainsaw, it seems there isn't much left to explain about the reputation and offensive power that this machine gun provided. The MG-42 was designed to use the standard German Mauser rifle cartridge in 7.9 2x5.7 mm, a favorite of the Third Reich. Note that the Nazi industry had an incredible variety of these ammunition, including high-penetration, explosive, and tracer variants. The Luftwaffe's high-velocity machine gun ammunition featured the PMK, or steel-cored phosphorus, round and the B, or observation round, which reached a speed of exit 15% elderly than the standard. The projectile PMK was a piercing incendiary, while that He-B was an incendiary explosive containing phosphorus and a pellet that it toward explode on contact with any target. In both cases, the end result was lethal. In 2021, a group of enthusiasts gathered to conduct a modern test of the National Socialist chainsaw. The idea was to conduct a fun and far from subtle experiment, to open fire with not one but 8 MG-42s on an innocent family van. After the extensive shooting, it was clear the vehicle would never return to the streets. In just a few seconds, the machine gun was able to cover the target with a storm of cartridges with enviable accuracy. This is precisely by that effect of impacts close to great speed that is spoke of a chainsaw that could literally cut in two to people, objects, and vehicles. The nickname Hitler's chainsaw is not just a threatening name, but that is a description of the power that the MG-42 was capable of unleashing. This platform was notable for its very high cyclic rate for a single-barreled weapon, averaging 1,200 rounds per minute. If we think in the designs guy Gatling from the United States, such as the GAU-8 or the minigun, these figures may not seem impressive, but believe us, in 1942 there was nothing like it. For example, the MG-34 had a maximum rate of fire of 850 rounds, while that unit's American machine guns like the M1919 Browning barely reached 600 rounds. The MG-42 surpassed them all, not only in volume of fire but also in reliability and operational capacity. According to experts in the European theatre, this machine gun was present in each corner, already sea-defending fortifications either mounted on armoured vehicles. But destructive power alone does not make a great tool of war, and the Germans they knew better than nobody. During the development of the MG42, he also sought to produce a weapon capable of engaging in hostilities at short range, but with an effective range sufficient to furrow all that territory that separated the trenches, the famous no man's land between the two armies. With an effective range of 1,200 meters and a maximum range of almost 4,000, we can say that they more than fulfilled their objective. Furthermore, the system was easy to reload even during combat. It was most frequently used of open links of between 50 and 250 rounds, although also existed belt-carrying drums with a capacity of between 50 and 75 rounds. This allowed Reich soldiers to experience the platform's brutal rate of fire within seconds. Such as we said in the introduction, further there, of the awesome arsenal to disposition of the Third Reich, its defeat was resounding and clear. A time completed that during World War II, weapons like the MG42 were of great interest to the United States and the Soviet Union. Thus, many subsequent designs were heavily inspired by Hitler's chainsaw, mimicking its operation and rate of fire. Indeed, Washington's military currently has several units of this model. For its part, Germany had to undergo a long period of restructuring of its armed forces. Despite having decades of experience in the creation of armaments, was but until the 1960s when the design of new platforms was undertaken. In that new generation of tools destructive, the Rheinmetall MG3 is one of the most notable, a sort of direct heir of the MG42 that remains active and current to this day. The fascination with the DNA of the chainsaw is not exclusive to Germany. Whether in the Austrian MG74 or in the MG42/59 Italian, the influence of those Third Reich engineers is visible. The powerful design of the MG42 was imitated even within some Soviet nations such as Yugoslavia, where he built low-license He model M53, maintaining He caliber 7.62 original and that rate of fire that earned it a unique reputation. The MG3 is virtually identical to its predecessor, except for the 7.62mm ammunition belt. Both weapons have provided great service to the forces that use it, and there are no signs of wanting to replace it. If something works well, better don't touch it. From being the favored weapon of an empire based on terror, it has become a world-renowned machine gun, present in the arsenals of nearly 30 nations. Operation Paperclip, the incredible plan of human instrumentation with Nazi scientists. Finally, we will talk about another type of weapon lost by the Nazis, human weapons, the most dangerous scientists of the Reich, who managed to evade justice by placing themselves at the service of their former enemies. In 1999, the New York Times published an obituary for a man called Theodor Benzinger. The note lamented his death and reviewed his elder's professional achievements. Benzinger had been an important scientist in the service of the US Navy and had made important contributions to the field of the medicine by creating the ear thermometer. However, what the obituary didn't say was that Benzinger was hiding a terrible secret. In his youth, he had been a prominent member of the National Socialist Party and even commanded the Third Reich's Air Force space station. In fact, the scientist was a close collaborator of Heinrich Himmler, the leader of the SS, whom he advised on each of his presentations about the Nazis' horrific medical experiments. But Theodor Benzinger was far from the only Führer's scientist who ended up working for the United States. There were hundreds of such cases, his of war criminals whose crimes were forgiven to change of collaborate with the American government. At the beginning of the Cold War, one of the first, the disputes between the Americans and the Russians were over Nazi scientists involved in developing advanced technology for Germany. Both powers sought superiority. Warlike, and for it, was essential count with the contributions of the scientists of the Third Reich. The United States was interested in the scientists behind Hitler's miracle weapons and revenge weapons, two military projects designed to create cutting-edge weaponry that would change the course of World War II. These included the powerful Messerschmitt fighter plane, the Fritz X anti-ship guided bomb, the colossal 1,500-ton Landkreuz monster tank, and the long-range V-2 ballistic missile. The Americans believed that if they could acquire these technologies before the Soviets did, the United States would become the undisputed world power and would have the capability to confront any threat from communist countries. The US government launched a military operation codenamed Overcast, the objective of which was to capture Nazi scientists and extradite them to the United States. This operation was made possible thanks to the discovery of the Osenberg list found in a bathroom at the University of Bonn in Western Germany. This list, compiled by German authorities, contained the names of engineers, chemists, physicists, and technicians who had been withdrawn from the front lines to dedicate themselves to weapons development. With this document in hand, the United States organized the search for the individuals. The operation was led by a secret agency, the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, and, with the plan in place, President Harry Truman granted it official authorization. However, the president imposed a condition for Operation Overcast to go ahead. It was strictly forbidden to recruit scientists who had played an active role in the Holocaust or in the military actions of the Third Reich. All of them, being considered war criminals, had to be excluded from the extradition mission. The drawback was that this left out many important scientists linked to crimes against humanity. Therefore, the Joint Intelligence Agency decided to extradite them anyway, and to evade Truman's condition, they altered the biographies of those chosen, removing the most lurid details and erasing their association with Nazism. The first scientist to be located by the Americans was the engineer Wernher von Braun, creator of the V-2 missile, which had been used for bombing the Allied countries and killing more than 7,000 people. In 1945, he surrendered to the US Army and handed over the classified documents containing the rocket plans. During World War II, Braun had been part of the SS and had also visited in several occasions the plant in that they manufactured the V-2. There was thousands of slave laborers lived in misery assembling the rockets. Many of them died due to the deplorable working conditions, and others, so many, were executed for trying to sabotage the project. Despite that Braun witnessed these atrocities, the Joint Agency cleared him of wrongdoing and brought him to North America, where he signed a contract to become a special employee of the War Department. His biography was altered to indicate that he had been merely an honorary SS colonel, with no actual involvement in the crimes. Although Operation Overcast was secret, its details were leaked to the press, resulting in a political scandal. Some of the strongest opponents of this operation included Albert Einstein and Eleanor Roosevelt. In March of 1946, the United States government, sought to solve this problem by changing the name of the operation, which was now called Paperclip, a play on words. The clips holding the clean biographies of Nazi scientists together. The plan continued to operate in the same way, but broadened their goals. Previously, the goal was to extradite 350 scientists, but now that number was raised to 1,000, and they would also be granted American citizenship. Over the next few months, these individuals were smuggled out of Germany, as the extractions often took place in Soviet-occupied territory. The Russians, meanwhile, were conducting similar maneuvers, and the two intelligence services became embroiled in a struggle to capture the most scientists. One of the most outstanding scientists that the United States recruited was Otto Ambros, known as Hitler's favorite chemist, was the creator of sarin gas, a deadly chemical weapon and one of the inventors of synthetic rubber. To produce this compound, Ambros was in charge of a slave factory at Auschwitz, and although he was convicted at the Nuremberg trials of mass murder and slavery, he was acquitted due to lack of evidence. He later worked for the US Department of Energy. The same thing happened to other Nazi scientists, such as the aeronautical engineer Siegfried Knemeyer, who was Hermann Göring's personal advisor and director of technical development for the Luftwaffe. Knemeyer had designed a prototype aircraft to carry out a radioactive bombing raid on New York City, but at the end of the war he was taken prisoner in the British occupation zone. The Americans rescued him and gave him a job in their Air Force. In fact, in 1966, Knemeyer was award-winning with the Medal by Service Distinguished, the highest distinction awarded to civilians by the Department of Defense. Werner himself von Braun, creator of the V-2 missile, continued his research under the wing of the American government. He held important positions at NASA and was instrumental in the creation of rockets for space exploration, such as Saturn V, which took the Apollo 11 crew to the Moon. Ultimately, Operation Paperclip served to recruit more than 1,600 Nazi scientists to who he/them gave jobs, dwelling, and, in many occasions, new identities. At present, the names of many of those extradited are still unknown, and it is one of the secrets better saved of the US government.